Welcome to the Trans-Apocalyptic Oasis show, where we transcend and include the apocalypse, which we've been doing long before Layman Pascal became an apocalyptarian. I would never say that he stole that from me, but he probably did. I'm Marshall Eon, and I'm here with Brandon Graham Dempsey, who is let's see, you're a minister of metamodernism.
Ooh, okay. I'm not an officially ordained one, but maybe
Right. Well, there is no officiality. There's no
yet.
officiating body.
Yeah.
And I also understand you're an apostate of Christ.
Well, we've had some relationship issues.
Tell me about those.
We're talking again. I want to pour this tea, and I wanted to get the introduction out of the way so that if people were just listening to this, they didn't
Pour
just
the
hear
tea,
this.
man.
This
Spill the
flow of-
tea.
You want to hear that?
Spill the tea on Christ.
Is this This is going to be video and audio.
Yeah,
I assume.
yeah.
Okay, good. So some people will be able
For
to
the
see
audio, he is pouring the tea from his what is that? Indigo, royal blue.
It's both. Speak to my my apostasy. Was that the prompt?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So I grew up in a religious family, traditional religious evangelical. I think that's where my interest in matters of ultimate concern ultimately stems from. And I was just from an early age, I always thought if I'm going to do something with my life, I should spend my time on the stuff that's most important. And what's more important than like the meaning of life and what's it all about and that sort of a thing. So from within the context of a religious house, I interpreted those questions that way, and that got me on the road to becoming a professor of Christian history. I guess I wanted to study biblical studies, again thinking that, well, if I'm going to do anything with my life, I should might as well be preoccupied with the important stuff, right? So I decided to go that route. Was thinking I'd go to seminary, and anyway, so I went to university. Actually, this started even in high school. I started reading biblical scholarship and whatnot, but I got to university and studied classics, learned Greek, did Hebrew, lived in Jerusalem for a bit, and really threw myself pretty intensely into biblical studies. I wound up writing this 150-page monograph my junior year of college on the New Testament and this old ancient Near Eastern mythic trope and whatnot. Anyway, so the point is, all I'm trying to convey is I really got deep into all that, and by the end of it, it was just it clashed so much. The biblical studies, historical criticism stuff that I learned, it clashed so much with sort of my devotional upbringing that it seemed like these things were telling two very different stories. So I felt like I'd been had a bit. I was pretty angry about that. And yeah, it was the break came when I was reading Faust at night in my dorm room under a red light. And Faust is there in his study, and he's like, I've studied philosophy and theology, and look, I'm no wiser than I was before, and just kind of exhausted with everything. And now he's going to turn himself to kind of the dark arts. And I felt like, all right, well, I'm done. I related to Faust on that, and I was going to throw myself into a life of hedonistic and aesthetic excess, which I did for some time. But anyway, that was the
what kind
nature
of the success or excess?
Well,
hedonistic success. What kind?
Yeah, it was temporary success. It ended in failure, but I became a dandy for a while. I got really interested in decadent era aesthetic art. So like late 19th century Oscar Wilde, Rimbaud, Baudelaire, this sort of thing. I moved into instead of going on to seminary, my initial plan, I wound up moving into an artist collective in Burlington, Vermont, headed by an aesthetic philosopher who was really obsessed with Nietzsche. And so I really just kind of lapped that up and got really into just studying Western civilization, studying the classics, classic literature, and and found in the golden days of the past some kind of potential haven or heaven that no longer seemed possible in the future, which was grim and utilitarian and uglied by postmodern nonsense. So I became essentially a sort of reactionary for a number of years. I mean, to the point of literally, I was also eccentric. So I would walk around, wearing frock coats and top hats, and I'd go to the tea house and translate a few pages of the Odyssey from Greek, and and this was just my existence. Anyway, that's its own story. But it didn't pan out. After my 4 years in that artist collective, I think I was just starting to read Kierkegaard, and I wound up taking a Kierkegaard class at Yale Divinity School, which really helped kind of, I think, get me beyond that. Of course, Kierkegaard, a philosopher who deals with the progression through the aesthetic stage into the ethical and ultimately the religious, and all that. So that was formative for that. Anyway, yeah. So that's my story there.
And then, how'd you get from there to here?
From there to here, a hop, skip, and a jump. I went to that master's program I was referring to at Yale Divinity School, studying religion and the arts, because after I'd kind of given up on this sort of mythic traditionalism that I'd been raised with, I found my way back to religion through the realm of art and aesthetics. Kind of again in that sort of initially in that kind of romantic Keatsian move, that. So I was interested in religion as an aesthetic phenomenon and transcendence as a aesthetic phenomenon. And so that brought me into that program. And I think just being kind of out of the dusty air of, this artist collective, which lovely as it was kind of a bastion of a certain kind of reactionary thought, and covered in dust on all the Victrolas and the phonographs and everything. And I think apart from my allergies, I also just felt a bit of a freshness come back into my life. At Yale. And so I studied with Christian Weinman, who is also very influential for me, and a couple other figures. And I just saw this really healthy form of kind of modern, postmodern, heading towards metamodern spirituality that seemed viable. And I was very interested in that. And again, learned a lot, read Kierkegaard, took a class on Catholic mysticism with Dennis Turner, who's a very kind of paramount figure in studies of mysticism. And that was the best thing ever. I mean, so I read Pseudo-Dionysius, and I started digging into Plotinus really intensely, and just a lot of mystics, and was really compelled by that. And started to see a different kind of spirituality coming into focus that was possible, where you didn't basically have to kind of sell your mind at the door, but when I was traveling in Jerusalem, there's a great sign that was outside of one of the churches. It was no questions inside of the church. Is aimed at tourists, because people would come in, they'd be like, what's that? What's that? So there's please, no questions inside the church. But when I was growing up, that was sort of my experience. No questions inside the church. So anyway, your background made me think of that. Here I was finding a way of sort of integrating all of my critical scrutiny and hyper-reflective nature with a form of spirituality that seemed possible again. So anyway, I did that program, and then graduated, became an editor, and continued working on my own artistic work and my own literary work, which was Metamodern, and gradually found, or not even gradually, it was sort of sudden. It happened just basically as we were heading into the COVID days, but kind of stumbled upon this metamodern community of folks who'd been gathered together by Hansi Freinacht, or at least that was sort of the epicenter that a lot of it was moving around. Whereas I'd come into Metamodernism through a different gateway, through kind of the cultural stuff that was being talked about. And I can talk about Metamodernism if you want. But anyway, that was very formative and important for kind of where I landed. So yeah, now I run a retreat center, and I'm a metamodern minister, I guess. So yeah.
I like the alliteration. Minister of Metamodernism.
Yeah, I like it.
So, oh yeah, why don't you talk about Metamodernism? Like, explain it briefly.
Metamodernism, as initially articulated by a couple of Dutch theorists around 2010, is a proposed paradigm for thinking about culture after postmodernism. And those particular theorists were starting to see particular trends that no longer kind of made sense in terms of looking at art through a postmodern lens. They were seeing this sort of ironic sincerity, this sort of quirkiness, this return to interests around, you know, meaning and myth, with this simultaneous recognition that somehow those things might not be possible, and yet inside in the interior we want that. We're seeking those connections that in some ways we almost know aren't really possible. Stuff like that. So that was sort of the initial articulation of this metamodern paradigm. And that was what I found around 2013. And I thought, wow, this really describes a lot of the work that I'm doing and the work that I love, the kind of cultural production that I was seeing and really resonating with. So I got really interested in that. And because I'd experienced sort of what a potentially reactionary approach to postmodernism can look like, sort of recoiling from it and running towards the past, I knew that wasn't the answer. I knew that we need to kind of move forward into whatever was next. So yeah, we couldn't just become traditionalists again. We needed to be postmodern. So they'd appealed to me for that reason. But a couple years later, in 2017, a pseudonymous philosopher persona named Hansi Freinacht published The Listening Society, in which he commandeered the term and expanded upon it, and tried to articulate that this sensibility that had been named was actually part of a broader kind of dialectical evolution of culture, such that it's not just like kind of a period, but it's actually sort of a natural stage of culture that comes after postmodernism, and bringing in a way of thinking, a developmental kind of dialectical way of thinking, which I found very attractive and actually did a lot better of a job in my mind explaining so many things. So I found it to be a kind of more robust interpretation of metamodernism, integrating it, but also kind of transcending that initial frame. So, and I was really, excited by that. And there'd already started to emerge this community of folks who were also energized by this idea. So now metamodernism is a bit more expansive, and people are still contesting and negotiating what it is and how we should be talking about it. But there's definitely arisen this sort of definite kind of tribe around this term. And now, yeah, I mean, it's switched into, I think, a bit more of a activist, I think, mentality, in the sense not of, hey, let's go grab our signs and protest necessarily, but like we need to do even more than that. We need to change systems. We need to think about designing civilization, and taking things forward. And so metamodernism is this sort of fragile, hopeful mentality at the end of the world, you could say, speaking of apocalypses, and apocalyptarians, that we appreciate this sort of crisis-ridden moment, and we don't have the luxury any longer of being apathetic postmoderns. We've got to get off the couch and do something. And that means boldly and maybe even recklessly creating things, and being imaginative and daring to try, and daring even to look foolish in your earnestness at trying, but trying nonetheless. So all of that spoke very, very deeply to my interests and my passions when I found it.
Right. But there's no real metaphysics there.
I'm going to pour myself some more tea.
Yeah, before you tackle that one.
So is that a statement or a prompt, a question,
Yes.
an exclamation, an interjection?
Well, it's just it's hard to imagine like what a metamodern spirituality would look like, because that's not really the domain of metamodernism, spirituality.
Right. So here's what I would say. There's a lot I could say. So you're asking about the metaphysics, I guess. I would say that one of the first things in this kind of movement, and I do think it's important to think of this as sort of a movement, a dialectical unfolding, because I think there are also kind of multiple steps or stages, if you want to think about that way, within metamodernism and a metamodern sensibility. You don't have to think about it developmentally necessarily, but I do think there are different ways of being metamodern that have a certain shared set of characteristics, but are also might lead to different kinds of realizations or instantiations. So within that context, I'll just say, I think that the initial move is the exiting of the postmodern thing, right? So I think I think postmodernism in many ways had already kind of given the shellacking to metaphysics. I read there's this great, he was considered a postmodern philosopher. He's still alive, Jean-Luc Marion, who has a great book called God Without Being. But anyway, he talked about Nietzsche as completing metaphysics, which I thought was a really, and maybe he didn't coin that, but I thought it was interesting, because this notion of like the completion of metaphysics was the realization that like none of it was real or something. That was like you just deconstructed it. I mean, Nietzsche, very famously was a critic of metaphysical thinking, and took pains to try to demonstrate the progression in philosophy towards making the real world an illusion. And of course, he was kind of his project was centered on nihilism, and he was wary of metaphysics for basically stripping the reality out of reality. So the first thing I want to say is that I think postmodernism was already about that and already tried to be doing that. A second thing I want to say really quick, just to give a nod to it, is the fact that metaphysics itself can mean a couple different things. Metaphysics in the sense of, what transcendent realm beyond or above the physical, aka the supernatural, exists, and what does that look like? That's one form of metaphysics. At another level, though, you can have a much more sort of minimal metaphysics, which I think arguably you need for even naturalistic science. Metaphysics as basically, what are our grounding principles and suppositions, and I mean, even things like just basic kind of logic in some ways could be considered metaphysical, like the fact that A equals A, is that a metaphysical claim? It's an epistemological claim, it's an ontological claim, these sorts of things, issues of identity, coherence, all this stuff. But even things more like the fact that the world is monistically natural or something, let's say, right? Like we live in a naturalistic material universe. That's a metaphysical claim. It's like that's the presupposition that we're working with. And you can view even something like, just the reductionistic sciences as having metaphysical assumptions at work. So when we talk about metaphysics, it can be a bit wiggly, because it's like, what exactly do we mean by that term? But I interpreted you as saying, and maybe you can agree or disagree or throw me out the window, defenestrate me. I hope you don't. I don't think you can. We are conversing virtually.
I can kick you out of this window. But
that's true. You can. But yeah, so I took you to be referring to the metaphysics of, the transcendent beyond as it relates to sort of the immanent here, or sort. Is that more or less right?
Sure. Okay. Yeah, anything that takes you into the spiritual dimension.
But see here again, and I'm not just being coy, but like, what do we mean by spiritual, right? Like, so I think this is a great way to get into
whatever
the issue
you want.
Well, like, so you asked, what is metamodern spirituality after metaphysics is sort of, gone. And I think the answer is that whatever it is, it's naturalistic. I think metamodern spirituality is a reimagination and a reconceptualization of spirituality as referring to the immanent frame. I in my framing of it, I talk about immanence is now the new locus of transcendence. Well, another way you could think about it is that somehow we've opened up another kind of sense of dimensionality that isn't just the old transcendent immanent one, that these are in relation, but somehow that there's this immanence, and maybe there's depth, or maybe there's, a going inward, or maybe there's complexification layers that add depth, or, there's like different conceptions of depth, but that don't have recourse to a transcendental beyond per se. So that's one easy answer. Another thing I'll say, which I've been influenced by folks like Layman, Pascal, and Bruce Alderman, and by extension, Ken Wilber, but their work in post-metaphysical spirituality, which is basically an agnostic take towards metaphysics altogether. So it's not even that we need to assume or not assume, we just don't need to go there, right? If a practice works, we can try to think about, like earlier today, right? I was just doing a meditation up in my gazebo, and I started doing for the first time some, like, I guess you'd call it subtle energy meditation. I was like doing this chi stuff. I'm like, wow, this is so cool. And like feeling this like magnetic like thing happening just by the, yeah. And now what do you do with that, right? You can be very
kind of a parlor trick.
Well, you can be very minimally metaphysical and just say, yeah, there are all sorts of phenomena we don't know. Two, maybe that sort of stuff is very easily explained by phenomena we do know, like air and electricity and all this stuff, right? Those are like minimalistic metaphysical answers to that. Whereas a maximalist answer would be like, there's this spiritual energy that you were tapping into that was coming out of your hands and through your meditation was like expanding and blah, blah, right? And that would be more maximally metaphysical. And I think post-metaphysical spirituality is sort of like, we don't have to do that. We can do the practice. It can be edifying, it can be efficacious, right? But we don't have to start making metaphysical claims about the reality behind it. So that's another metaphysical move in metamodernism, I think.
Efficacious at doing what?
Well, that might not be the best example, right? Because maybe the efficacy there is
that's
just, wow, that's
sure,
cool.
But like,
but you're right. So the efficacy, I would say, better example would be like meditation, right? So there's endless studies that have shown the value of meditation, making people calmer, making you better focused.
There's also plenty of research on the dark side of meditation.
Oh, like like what, like psychosis or something, or anxiety, or like?
Yeah, sure. Or like bringing up things that people don't know how to handle. I don't know. Fair. I tend to feel that. I mean, I remember Adyashanti, who's a spiritual teacher. He said that meditation can be both undervalued and overvalued.
Sure, that's true.
There's like a strong overvaluing, I think, in well, there was a lot in California. Like if we just sit there for an hour and get a little bit more calm, and that lasts, I don't know, a couple hours, like, is that really efficacious? Like, where's that going?
Right. So like, let's say though, just that you do have an extended practice that leads to altered states of consciousness that are just, profound, healing, transformative, right? And I know people like that. That is efficacious. And you can do the minimal or the maximalist metaphysical move there and say either, hey, they touched contact with deep parts of themselves and maybe did some interior psychological healing, and hey, that's great. Or you could say something like, yeah, they traveled to the causal realm and, or whatever, right? So like how you interpret those things is going to be laden with metaphysical assumptions, and in some ways it's going to be unavoidably laden with them, because even the naturalistic materialistic frame is also metaphysically laden. But in any event, it's going to be right. And so I think another kind of the post-metaphysical idea would just be sort of like, well, you know, is that what matters? Do we have to focus on trying to explain things, or can we just kind of lean into this is valuable, this is helpful, this increases well-being, coherence, integration, et cetera, et cetera. So that's another element to it. Now I could go a little bit further though, and say that those are a couple of initial moves I think that happen.
Yeah.
I do think that there's a deepening that happens though, that when you make that initial move out of this postmodern, you know, let's just call it nihilism, but I also don't want to be unfair. You know, I don't want to be, I know I'm just referring to a particular way that people sometimes can unhealthily engage with this postmodern relativistic frame, right? And it can lead to this nihilism. And one thing that happens when you move out of that towards a metamodern stance of, hey, I know what the nihilism thing is like. That's not good for me. So, you know, let me engage spirituality in some way because this will be valuable. When you do that, which is the initial move, and I think I could refer to a couple different examples of like where you see that starting to pop up in culture in meaningful ways. But after you do that, you can then start living into that, right? You've already made the commitment. Well, you know, yeah, I know what nihilism is. I don't want to do that. I'm going to do the spiritual practice. And then you start living, and then you start habituating yourself towards the practice. And then something interesting can happen of when you do the practice, the thing works, and then you start to believe it. You know what I mean? And you start to believe it with a kind of newfound sense of earnestness. You believe it with a second naivete. I think Paul Ricoeur coined that phrase, but Kierkegaard actually also talks about this second naivete, and that I think that that's its own thing. It's sort of like life was meaningless is sort of this postmodern nihilistic relativistic stance that can emerge. And then the early metamodern thing can be like, yeah, life is meaningless, but you know, why lean into that? Why not lean into life is beautiful and meaningful and I'll do the spiritual practice? So there's sort of a meta awareness of like the possibilities, and you're choosing one versus the other. But then by choosing one versus the other, you're daily doing these sorts of things that habituates you to start thinking in terms of meaning and, you know, maybe even metaphysics again. So I think that can also happen, and I think that there's something interesting about that. I think, though, the last thing I'll say about that for now is just that you never lose sight of where you came from. You know, you always know that, or you should know. Becomes dangerous if you forget that your new stance is based on affirmation, choice, and habituation. You know, and so because of that, it keeps you metaphysically humble. Keeps you epistemically humble, because, you know, as soon as you start saying like, well, actually, no, you know what, I did the subtle energy thing, and like that's really it, and like there is this vast, you know, this and that going on outside in the cosmos, then you're sort of like, yeah, but you know what, I might be jumping back to this sort of overly earnest, naive stance that I know all too well, and so I should recall and you know, be aware of that. And so there's that oscillation that goes back. You don't get taken over by a new kind of zeal, because you're always realizing that in some ways it's all kind of grounded potentially on nothing. And I think that that's an important context, which might sound really grim to some people, but I think it's also really crucial, because otherwise you wind up falling for all the pathologies of naivete again.
Grounded on nothing. What is the nothing here?
Well, I call it the void, but
then what is the void?
What is the void? The void is first and foremost a state. It's a psychological state of uncertainty. Well, to bring up Nietzsche again, right? There's this famous scene where Nietzsche describes this madman gets his lantern, goes out into the marketplace in the morning, seeks God. He says, you know, where is God? Where is God? And everyone there is sort of, you know, just laughs at him. And he goes on then on this whole spiel of like, don't you get it? You know, we've killed God. God is dead and we are his murderers. And how will we ever, you know, become worthy of so great a deed? But then he says, basically, what were we doing when we unchained this earth from its sun? You know, whither are we going? You know, away from all suns? And he just paints this image of vertigo, of just the bottom has fallen out. There's no up or down. There's no clear direction. And that's the phenomenological correlation, or the correlate to an epistemological chaos of like, I don't know what's true. I don't know what matters. I don't know anything anymore. My whole sense of what the center was, the center has fallen apart, you know, and now I'm just sort of tumbling through the void, as it were. And so that's what I mean by the void. I mean, you could start to become metaphysical about the void, I guess, right?
Well, you could,
but
because
yeah.
and whole traditions do,
Sure.
right? I mean, that's sort of the specialty of Buddhism, is like Sunyata, and there's actually many kinds of emptiness in
Right.
Buddhism. Like, that's their specialty.
Well, so there's an interesting distinction here to be made, though. So, and then I'll come back to whether or not they are or maybe aren't the same thing. But there's another void or abyss or darkness that's referred to, but it's the void and the emptiness of the mystics, right? It's the cloud of unknowing. It's the dark light of you know, of basically the unia mystica, where everything falls away and you're just like, you know, yeah, naked before the void. And that void, though, the difference is that the valence of it is totally different. It's one of rapture and bliss, and maybe not even those things, because they're too tactile and sensible. It's more like just liberation and freedom, right? And you get that sense of even of like an emptiness suggests freedom and expanse and openness and all that, right? So that's a very positive valence, and it's in fact like the highest, arguably, valent state you could probably ever experience. So that's a void too. And I think that I tend to make very much a distinction between these two. At the same time, it's possible that they are the same thing. For example, you brought this up, but in meditative states, right? You know, you can hard things can come up. I actually dated someone briefly who, when I was living here at Sky Meadow as an intern, she would meditate with the rest of us in the morning and whatnot, but she would have experiences of terror, of like falling into the void. And the question is sort of like, and I guess you could bring in Nietzsche's madman here too, right? Is it sort of like, what if you find the void before you're ready? You know, what if the void kind of, you stare into the abyss and the abyss stares back and all that, right? But basically the point was that those states can be encountered in other contexts and have the positive valence. But if you're not ready, or if there's some hang up there, or there's some trauma or whatever, then that same state can actually be one of terror.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting idea.
The void tends to bring up a lot of fears for people.
You know.
But I sort of see the void as like the fundamental nature of existence.
Well, I retain, and this is in some ways an idiosyncrasy, but I'm fond of it. I retain a ambivalence, if not a wariness, towards that view. So ever since I had my crisis of faith and break with the J-man, and discovered Nietzsche and discovered his withering critiques of Christianity, I've been dead set to not lose sight of those critiques and those crucial insights that whatever we do, we can't let the void become our ideal, let's say, which is what in some ways nihilism does. It says that the best thing is the least real, right? Is it's has no predicates, it has no description, it's this and that, right? And that it's a transcendent beyond, it's not an imminent present. So it's an aim that makes us give up on our earthly lives. And so, I mean, Nietzsche's critique, right, was that it wasn't just the death of God that brought in nihilism. It's that it was that God, as traditionally conceived, also was a form of nihilism. And so religion, traditional religion, and, you know, kind of atheistic, materialistic nihilism are their own forms of this sort of no saying to life. And that to me really resonated. And I think that whatever metamodern spirituality strives to be, it needs to be a yes saying, needs to say yes to reality, to the immanent frame, to existence. And so I'm wary of religious traditions like kind of traditional Buddhist articulations of, you know, nirvana and no self and this sort of a thing, right? That somehow posit that the ideal is the empty. So I'm much more interested in complexification and the growing richness of things.
Yeah, but those are not mutually exclusive.
Well, so
And that's my orientation.
well, it was
Like, I can recognize that emptiness is the most fundamental nature of reality, out of which everything else emerges.
But see,
And it doesn't make
but
everything else less real.
question though, I can agree to that, but it's a question of where we set our trajectory, right? Because, for example, we're also at core like atoms, right? We can reduce ourselves to atoms, but then when you reduce something, you lose the complexity and you lose all of the richness that we've gained from the complexity, right? So if I were to say, oh, well, atoms are so fundamental, they've got to be better than what I am, I want to be an atom. Well, the best way to do that is to kill myself and let, you know, my atoms go everywhere, right? So I'm already saying no to life, and I'm achieving a state that is infinitely more degraded in terms of its conscious awareness and its richness than my current state. So the question isn't just what do we come from, because I can agree that we come from the void, but it's a matter of where are we going to. So where is our God? Is our God, you know, at the base of reality, or is our God what we're moving towards?
Right. That's the journey of ascent.
Yeah. Well, not necessarily. Well, I mean, I don't know if you're referring to Wilber in that statement or not, but you know, Wilber has the whole ascent descent thing, right? But actually, ascent, as Wilber talks about it, I'm talking about Ken Wilber here, if I don't know if you know, just for context for your audience, you know, he has the ascending path and the descending path. So it's actually the ascending path, which is the ascetic one. It's the one that wants to get away from everything. It's the one that wants to become more and more generalized and abstract, whereas the descenders are the ones who are digging into the richness of stuff and reality.
Well, I see the journey of ascent as the journey from the separate sense of self to the divine.
Yeah, I could agree with that.
And then the journey of descent as coming back from that. And that's how I see the Christ innovation as the resurrection of the world. The resurrection representing, because I see like Christianity as a critique on a lot of the like Eastern schools. You know, Buddhism is sort of a critique on the Indian schools that saw reality as the infinite consciousness, as there's being this sort of eternally existing substratum. And so Buddhism critiques that and said, no, it's not that. Like, we see that, but it's actually this sunyata, the inherent emptiness of everything, that's actually the most fundamental nature of reality. And so they both sort of see the world as an illusion. And then the resurrection was one of the unique innovations of Christianity that said, like, well, no, actually, Christ represents the divine made flesh.
Mm-hmm.
That actually that the world is reborn as more real
Mm-hmm.
through Christ, because it's sort of it's the divine in the material, the sort of recognition of
Right.
that. So it's
Yeah.
the recognition that, like, the divine is the divine isn't what's real, and this is all Maya or
Mm-hmm.
illusion or the dream state.
Mm-hmm.
That actually this is the work of the divine, and so in a sense it all becomes more real.
Yeah. Well, I very much agree with that. And to the degree that JC and I are still talking, that's kind of the grounds of our relationship, because I do think that you very much can read the Christian story as a celebration of the divine in matter, the incarnation. You're talking about the resurrection, but in some ways they're kind of, mirrors of each other. But certainly, and some theologians have really leaned into that. Of course, other theologians miss that boat very much. But I do think that that is a really profound and important interpretation of Christianity, and one I really agree with. And the thing that I'm interested in, though, is I guess I'm trying to just even go further than that, because in the way that, say, like a Teilhard de Chardin does, right? Because he sees, he was a Jesuit priest, but also a scientist, and he saw this evolutionary thing unfolding, and he saw that we were complexifying and moving towards eventually what would be the Christogenesis, the coming, like that the kind of eschatological, thing on the horizon, the omega point, as he talks about it, the apocalyptic oasis on the horizon, is this spiritual incarnation that occurs by history unfolding to its fullness. So that's the thing, is it's a matter of fullness versus emptiness. Okay. And I think that by disposition, by background, by my wariness of nihilism in all its forms, I want to see the spiritual as the increase of fullness, rather than an embrace of emptiness.
But you can't get that without the embrace of the emptiness through which the fullness emerges. I mean, they're not separate. There's a kind of dualism there.
Yeah. Well, and this, I think, probably is some hang up I'll have to break through at some point, because again, like, I understand, then you get into like the Nagarjuna stuff, and like, emptiness is form and form is emptiness and that sort of stuff. And I'm all for that. And I was just kind of raising some of these questions in our, metamodern spirituality group of like, well, okay, that's all good. From the standpoint of non-duality, we can make those claims, but what are we really thinking about in moving towards non-duality, right? Do I want to be seeking the empty ground, or do I want to be seeking the rich fullness? Because it seems to me that do either of those things requires going in opposite directions, right?
Not for me.
No.
I mean, even as we're talking right now, like,
Yeah.
I just drop into emptiness. Like, I become void.
So you're saying I'm not a very interesting interlocutor then? No, I'm just kidding.
No, I become the void that then receives your fullness.
Well,
and that makes an imprint on my soul.
Mm-hmm. Let me try to explain where I'm coming from in this way then. I've been really interested in this complexity narrative and the idea of emergence. I'm writing a book right now called Emergentism, because I'm trying to talk about a whole spiritual paradigm that really integrates all these things together into, one kind of package deal. And so emergence, right, has these layers to it. I think the most, I think, helpful one is thinking primarily in terms of matter and life and mind and culture. And just real quick, matter, we all get that, but then out of matter comes life, and life is its information processing system. It's able to learn through DNA of its reality and all this stuff. And then life develops into, develops into mind, and mind emerges out of life. And mind here being our nervous system. So now we're able to learn and understand through experience and that sort of thing, right? This is a whole new complexity layer that's miles and miles away from just, crystal matter, right? Where like the complexity is exponentially larger here. And then out of our animal nervous system, you get self-consciousness, which is linguistically mediated, and you get symbol and you get culture. So this is sort of the stack, right, of complexification. And I see that as being the increase of knowledge in the universe, and that the universe is gaining more and more understanding of itself through this complexification process. Now, what's interesting is when I meditate, it feels like I'm actually dropping down the levels, right? First, this chattering, self-justifying narrative in my head, linguistically mediated, falls away. And so my thoughts are gone. So my mind is just empty, right? But I'm still mind. I'm feeling everything, right? And then you can get to meditative states where even that drops away, and then sense perception is gone, right? So you've basically just whacked off. That was a poor choice of words. You basically whacked away culture and then mind, and now you're just this sort of like you're decreasing through the levels of complexity, essentially, right? So that you've sort of lost consciousness rather than gained it. And that's disconcerting to me, because I feel like that's not the right direction to be going in. And so I'm trying to clarify some of these things in terms of, because that seems to me that not nihilistic thing.
Have you lost consciousness or just content?
Well, if you do it the way some of these really intense, folks do, where they practice cessations, right? You actually lose consciousness, and that's considered a valuable thing to do in a Buddhist lineage, right? It's like, wow, you can do cessations. That's cool. And it's like, why is that cool? Why do we want to be losing consciousness? Why do we want to be checking out of reality?
Because it erases what's false of you.
But I mean, in that sense, everything is false. So there's that built-in metaphysical assumption that the false is what is real and complex. And I want to say the opposite.
No, what's false is like conditioned historical patterning of consciousness.
Okay.
That sort of prevents the freshness of essence or true nature from emerging.
I like this. I just had this great sense. I'm like looking at you, and you're like wearing black, and you're like in this church, and I feel like I'm like, I've come to, if not confession, then some kind of, you're dispensing spiritual wisdom.
Yeah, you better confess your sins.
Apparently I've been whacking off in meditation, so that's frowned upon.
Yeah.
Maybe that's my problem. No, but anyway, so let's follow that for a second. So if you're losing that socially conditioned falseness through the process, that's fine. But then you only become aware of that once you come back to consciousness, right? Because in the midst of it, you're just nothing, right? So is it sort of like a reboot?
Gone.
Yeah, you're gone. So, and again, when you're gone is like, the ideal is to be gone. Well, that's called nihilism, right? So I don't like that. And so I want to find a different
but you're putting it in either category. That's not the convention. I mean, conventionally understood nihilism is like, it's epistemological, or it's like reality devoid of cognized meaning and substance. But it's cognized.
Well, like, all right, let me throw this.
It doesn't mean nihilism, it doesn't mean reality vanishes and consciousness ceases. That's not what most people mean by nihilism.
Well, so like Nietzsche says, I think he's drawing on Schopenhauer here, where Schopenhauer, I think, is the one who says that really the big question is what we make of the truth of Silenus. And so Silenus, is this satyr who he said that the best thing in life is to have never been born. And if you can't do that, then the second best thing is to die as soon as possible. And that's the truth of Silenus, right? Now, I would say that's exemplary of the nihilistic tendency. And so the question then would be for like a Buddhist practitioner or yourself, or maybe those are the same thing, but someone who is looking at this ground of being and the cessation of consciousness as being the ideal. How is that not the truth of Silenus? Like, the question would be just simply like, is it the case that the best thing would to have been never to have been born, right? I mean, life is suffering, right? So that would be my question, to trying to parse out what is it that we're after in the non-dual transcendent mystical experience. Is it to feel like we don't exist?
No, I wouldn't say that's what I'm after, or that's an ideal. I'm just sort of recognizing the emptiness as fundamental.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, you can have experiences of emptiness. You have many degrees of emptiness in many forms. I mean, you can experience emptiness within you can just experience like empty space within you. And that's a kind of emptiness that emanates, let's say, from the big emptiness. And you can experience cessation of consciousness also. And that's not an ideal, it's just a possibility.
Well, that's an interesting question, though, is like ideal versus possibility. Because like I definitely know it's a possibility. When I think about it as an ideal, though, it's sort of like, what's the goal of the spiritual life? When I answer that question,
To not be goal oriented.
Okay, well, I disagree, I guess, in some ways, because I feel like, yeah, and this could be rich, but I feel like this gets at all these. Oh, there you are. Okay. Let me know if I freeze at any point. If I disappear from existence. So the reason why I don't like the idea that it's not about being goal oriented is that as things complexify, desire emerges, urge emerges, will emerges, valence and emotion emerge, and they deepen, and that is the richness of reality, right? Again, if I go down the stack and I become an insect, what motivates me is going to be a lot less interesting, rich, compelling, beautiful. It's going to be not the full, color, let's just say, of our human experience. And matter, of course, doesn't have urge or desire, because you need to have life before you get anything like this orientation towards, continuing to exist or not continue to exist, right? So even from the outset, when you think about where desire comes from, it is rooted in the desire to continue existing, that's life's fundamental imperative ultimately. Not to say that that's what it's all about, but meaning like if it doesn't do that, then you're screwed because you're not going to be alive anymore. So at base, our desires are rooted in our own yes saying to life. We want to live. And so desire is not a bad thing. And as that complexifies and becomes more rich, our desires and our wishes become, our aspirations become more rich, such that we eventually want to aspire towards spiritual heights, and experience profound mystical states and that sort of a thing. And so I see that as an increase. So when I think about the end goal of the spiritual life, I see it as an aspiration towards the attainment of non-duality, in which subject and object distinctions disappear. And I base that on, a reading of a lot of mystical literature. And because it sounds like, for one thing, also that state, whatever it is, if you can get there, is like the best thing ever. Like Plotinus is like, people struggle and go to war for kingdoms and this and that, but like the most important thing by far than any kingdom is that like richness that you can attain in yourself through contemplative mystical union. There are other reasons why I think the whole subject-object non-duality thing is important, but for me, that's an aspiration. And when I read mystics like Plotinus, Pseudo-Dionysius, Eckhart, and Shankara, there's this sense that this is a fullness, that there's a profundity there, and it's not just an emptiness. And at a certain point, obviously, this becomes really hard to parse out because we're dealing with ineffable categories where language gets left behind. So, one person's fullness is another person's emptiness and all this stuff. But
so there are actually many kinds of non-dualities.
Right. Well, and speaking to what you were saying about possibility, right, then that becomes a crucial, I think, kind of spiritual question. If it's possible to experience different forms of non-duality, if it's possible to experience the emptiness, but it's also possible to experience, the grand, fullness, let's just say, how and why do we choose one versus the other? Do we choose them both, right? Do we try to triangulate and say, oh, okay, I can go all the way up there and I can go all the way down there, and like maybe that's what it's about? I don't know. I'm a student.
It's a lot of, all of these traditions have been arguing for millennia over what's the ideal and what is the ultimate.
Yeah.
And for me, I think like, well, why do I need an ultimate? Why don't I just allow reality to reveal its possibilities? Like become an instrument for reality to reveal its potential.
Well, my answer to that question is one of consistency, right? Like you made a choice to be where you are right now, talking to me. Clearly, you've made many choices to like stay healthy, stay alive, have the ability. No, you've never made.
I'm here in spite of the death drive.
Well, aren't we all? But again, that's the nihilism that we've got to fight rather than, throw ourselves into. But my point is that we all make decisions based on our motivations that are moving us through our emotions and our desires. That's what moves us. And
so there's a self-preservation drive or a survival drive.
And so there's also those other drives too, though. It's like what like King Lear is like, need, it's not about need, like it's there's more to life than just what we need. We also have wants and desires, and that's part of the richness and the fullness of life. And so anyway, to answer your question, I'm not trying to avoid it, but the answer is that I don't feel like it's consistent to say, well, I'm just going to let whatever comes happen and just be an open, canvas for reality to unfold itself. I say, as I make a million decisions about all the other things I'm doing in my life towards certain goals and away from others, right? It's like, I wouldn't also be like, well, I'm just going to stick my finger in this electrical socket just because, why not? Like, we have distinctions that we make of better, worse, good and bad. And yes, they're in some ways cultural constructions. They are materially driven contingent realities and this and that. But it's like, why do we abandon our aspirational, motivational interests at the level where they matter most, namely the spiritual and the truly divinely aspirational, right? Then it's like, that's the biggest question, like the one of ultimate concern. How am I going to orient myself in the world towards the greatest possibility rather than the greatest tragedy or suffering or negativity? And so anyway, that'd be my answer.
Yeah, I agree about doing something rather than nothing, but I don't think you can really justify determining that there is a like an ideal state or experience that you then need to marshal all your resources towards achieving.
Mm-hmm. Well, I do agree to that to a point, right? I like even today in meditation, I was like, you know what? I tried too hard, and that's getting in the way of my meditation, right? But there's a different,
That's clear.
there's a balance always too, right? Because like the whole Eckhart Tolle thing of like, hey man, it's already perfect. Like whatever you're doing, like there's no goal, there's no aim, there's no whatever. It's like, well, yeah, there is. Like it's important to meditate. If we don't meditate, how will we do the thing where we get, greater self-knowledge? Like if we don't begin to make these distinctions, if like I'm murdering my family, who I'm also simultaneously having an incestuous relationship with, like I'm not going to do an Eckhart Tolle move and be like, it's already perfect, man. Like there's also the Buddhist injunction towards the decrease of suffering. So I know this eventually starts leading into this kind of around we go thing, and people start getting clever of like, well, isn't it a desire to seek, enlightenment and that sort of thing? And I don't mean to do that, but there are very legitimate ways that like we need to wrap our heads around.
It depends on what's driving the desire for enlightenment, or the desire to have the fullness, or the desire to experience the mystical state. I think you're afraid of the void.
I'll have to think about that.
You don't have to think about it. You got to sit with the void.
Well, I guess a lot of my spiritual journey has been sitting with the void. And then it was sort of like, this ain't cool. Void? Well, again, right? I mean, like
a kind of cognized void, cognitive void.
The void
of meaning, or
the void of if I do have a problem, maybe my problem is I'm conflating these different voids, but my issue is that I see them related, right? And I'm also not the first person to, I mean, when Buddhism first showed up in the West, that was one of I think Schopenhauer was one of them, was sort of like, oh, okay, Eastern nihilism, gotcha. Now, do we chalk that up to a misunderstanding, or do we chalk that up to so that's a kind of a fresh perspective on this whole, the best thing to do is get out of the world sort of a thing? And to be fair, I mean, Buddhism can manifest in different forms, developmental stages and all that sort of a thing, right? So like a traditional ascetic, might be doing a different kind of thing. And then the question becomes, well, which one was the Buddha, right? I mean, part of the reason Jesus and I broke up was because I realized through all the study that the stuff that Jesus was talking about wasn't the Jesus I thought he was, right? It's sort of like, oh crap. And then you become very disillusioned when you realize, or you think you realize, and of course these things are debatable, but when I felt like I realized, oh man, my whole religious ideal, the figure, my God concept, is actually a deluded apocalyptic prophet. Speaking of nihilism and speaking of deconstruction, right? Like you got to sit with that. So I think, what was the Buddha? What was the Buddha really saying? Maybe the Buddha was really saying, hey, life is awful. Life is suffering. Suffering's caused by desire, like being an animal that is just existent, right? And we got to get out of this situation as quickly as possible, Truth of Silenus style. And I mean, you look at the Jains, and that's basically what they, did. Their founder starved himself to death. So the point is, all this stuff I see as through the lens of nihilism, saying yes to no, yes to life versus no to life, and this whole issue. And clearly, I'm hung up about it. But to answer your rhetorical question, I don't think it's because I haven't sat with the void per se.
Well, you're telling me that that's where your meditations are going.
No, not at all. Well, oh, you mean because I was talking about going down through the stack?
There's a kind of emptiness that emerges.
Sure. Right. But then the question is, is that the right practice to be doing? Like that's where I lead to. I'm sort of like, I think, because here's the thing.
You're using the fact of the empty experience to question or doubt the efficacy of the practice. And what I'm saying is that actually the emptiness showing up is is proof of the efficacy of the practice.
I think that the efficacy
Because
of
emptiness is just one of the possibilities, and it's a necessary one.
So I would point to the efficacy of the practice in what I see to be the compassion of Buddhists, and the charitability, and the all that, right? So that's I feel like
You gravitate towards the substance.
So if I'm looking for,
where do you think the substance emerges in, or within, or through, or
right? But I'm not discarding that. Like, that's my point, is like, yes, cosmologically we could say things arise from emptiness. I'm totally willing to accept that. The question is, in terms of value, where do we place our value? Is it on what things came from, or on where they're going? So this is what I see, that it's not about ascent or descent. It's about are we trying to basically be spiritual reactionaries, would be one way of putting it, and try to go back away from the pain and suffering of being a human being? Or do we become spiritual futurists and see the future, the forward momentum, the growth, the development, the complexification as being the proper telos, right, of our spiritual activity? I think very clearly, I would say you can make a case for both, and I don't think that it's like, oh, it's one or the other.
Well, yeah, I mean, but what happens though is then when you sit down and you're just here,
Mm-hmm.
and the emptiness emerges.
Mm-hmm.
That's what is revealed as the next thing for you.
But you could also say that you look outside and you see the fullness increasing too. It's like,
fullness does not negate the emptiness.
Agreed, but which do we orient ourselves towards?
Orient yourself towards what is emerging for you.
Okay, I can do that.
Yeah, I mean, it's all about what I really appreciate about Christianity is the emphasis on the individual consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
Or the soul.
Which can be a pro and a con.
In the East, there tends to be sort of a diminishment of the value of the individual consciousness, because they're all doing the thing you are. Like, how do I get to the timeless, eternal, universal? And in the West, we're more focused on the individual, the individual, the unique individual, the idiosyncratic, the personal.
Yeah. And I'm about
and
that.
So the answer is like, what is being revealed to you? And that may be different for someone else.
So are you taking like a relativist stance here of like, there isn't kind of a right, there's not a truth that we're aiming at, it's just sort of like whatever helps people?
Well, we're all aiming at truth. It's just that there are many kinds of truth. There are many flavors of truth. And your soul is going to unfold according to its own inner logic. It's like you're your own logos.
Mm-hmm. I think that's true, but it raises an interesting question though, because it's the question of pathology, which is the one that I use as kind of my normative basis, or one of them. I think that something like good and evil doesn't really work so well, right? In terms of like doing this or that. Was that an immoral? Was that what do they call it in Catholicism? A mortal sin? That sort of thing. Like, no, we don't do that. But is something healthy versus unhealthy? And I get that again from Nietzsche. And I think that that's a really good question to be asking. So if you adopt a sort of, if not relativist stance, but at least a pluralistic stance, let's say, that there are sort of different paths for different people, I think you do have to ask the question, are some of those paths leading in pathological directions? Now, for the record, I'm not in any way suggesting that Buddhists meditating on the void, is making society like, a bad place or anything like that. So that's not what I'm getting at. But I do think certain kinds of spiritual practice can be viewed pathologically,
Like what?
like fundamentalism, I think is a pretty pathological orientation, right? If you feel the need to basically hole up half the population, like all the women in your society, you have to like cover them up and like hide them away, and
So
like
how would
say,
you define fundamentalism?
I guess I would say that it's an orientation towards matters of ultimate concern that I'm going to try to think of a definition potentially that isn't just, my own kind of bias, that could be more objective, but it is hard, because what I want to say is that it's very parochial and it's very narrow. It tends to be literalist. It tends to be lacking interpersonal depth. It tends to be, absolutistic. I mean, again, like
Okay.
is that
So that's like that's a lower stage.
right? So I think you can view that sort of developmentally,
And it's not necessarily pathological. I mean, it's stage appropriate, let's say.
and it is context appropriate too, right?
Right.
So at the same time, though, I mean, not to go off on a tangent, I do think that there is normativity in development as well, right? So it's like, yes, let's say you find your whatever you want to call it, some cult or group, maybe it's an organization that you identify with, having been really chaotic and disorganized and going down the bad path, right, and all that. But then you get everything comes together and you cohere, and you're like, you know what, I'm going to take this sort of orderly stance, and I'm going to clean my room and do that whole Jordan Peterson thing, and right, and it's like it's all about tradition and eating red meat and all this stuff, like I literally know people that like, it's the Bible, it's red meat, it's the Constitution, like that's basically what you need, right? And so relatively, it's better for that person in their own life development to be in that situation than, I don't know, like a drug runner or something like that, right? And just kind of really chaotically, down and out. And so that order is structuring and helpful, and that's great. And so you can see a developmental, progression there. But at the same time, now we can also look at that and be like, if you're just saying it's all about the Bible, red meat, and the Constitution, that's kind of a parochial, narrow way of seeing the world. Like there's a lot more to the world. And of course, now we see this because, there's a developmental trajectory that's been already sort of, what would you say? Like a path that's been trod, so that we can have some people can have the vantage that that's the case. When you say okay, I'm not sure if you're like agreeing or if you're like, okay, go on, but maybe it's both.
No, it's like, okay, I get it.
Yeah.
So, but beyond that sort of caricature,
Yeah. Well, it's not just a caricature. I mean, like I spent a good amount of my life in that world, so I know the pathologies of it. I know how destructive it can be. I mean, about the Duggars, for example, and like all the craziness there, and like this stuff is bad for people, and it's bad for
sure, but it's irrelevant to us.
Well, yeah, I'm trying to remember. So trying to follow that thread of Ariadne back to where this all came from, because we're talking about pathologies and spirituality, and I was just trying to make the point that I think that you can be pathologically oriented in your spiritual practice. And I use the example of, I wouldn't just say fundamentalism, I'd probably say fundamentalist extremism would be like, I think we could kind of agree that if you need to blow people up because of your sense of absolute truth, that's pathological. Or I would say a great example might be, although you could argue with this, I suppose, especially if you're a Jain, like killing yourself, starving yourself to death for your sense that you can't, ahimsa, you've got to do no harm, that's also literally pathological. That is increases your suffering and decreases your vitality to the point of extermination. So,
but all those people are basically saying, here's the ideal in my mind that I need to move towards.
Sure. And they
so
had
it's like fundamentalism happens in the mind.
Yeah. So then it really matters what your ideal is, which is kind of where this whole conversation, I think, is revolving around. Because if you choose the wrong ideal, you might be finding yourself
like, why are you not a fullness fundamentalist?
Well, I think that certain things are either paradoxical or, like, if you're how would you say, like a health nut usually isn't actually a health nut because they're pushing themselves far too much, and they're probably like, they have a super low BMI and they're actually unhealthy, they're not eating enough, that sort of thing, right? But like if you were totally committed to health, I don't think that's a bad thing. But the point is, you'd actually be kind of a relaxed person, because it's bad for your health to be super high strung. So there are certain kinds of, it's like, you know what I mean? So, all right, I guess I'll take the idea of I'm a fullness fundamentalist, but I think fullness means broadness and vantage and variety and wisdom, right? So it's all those things. So yeah, I'm all about those things, but if you maximize those things,
yeah, there's no room for the emptiness.
There's no room for the emptiness.
Where are we going to put the emptiness? Where are we going to put the fullness?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm open to the idea that like the fullness requires the emptiness. That has a nice sort of balanced, or conjunction of opposites sort of a thing. I could lean into that, and I could totally lean into the idea of, hey, there's a complexification non-duality and there's an emptiness non-duality, and we should probably be doing both or something like that. Like that could be the case. But for me, where the rubber meets the road is, it's like I have a limited life. I need to know. That's a bit, well, yeah, all right, I'm a fundamentalist of fullness, so I'll say it. I need to know what the what the practices that I should be engaged in. What's the best use of my time? Like if I'm trying to gain wisdom and experience insight and experience an awakening to non-dual God consciousness, then I think there are certain things that help that and other things that hinder it. And so that's also why I feel like it's not just, people might hear some of this conversation or things that I say and think I'm just being theoretical or something, but like I don't look at it that way. I feel like these things are really important, and if we don't think enough about our orientations in the world and what we're actually aiming for, then we might end up in not the best places. And of course, you're doing the practices throughout, so it's also trial and error and all that stuff. It's not like I need to get this all set up front and then I'll commit to it. It's like it's a developmental process too. So I think where I land on these things in 10 years is going to be, hopefully it's going to be very different, but hopefully it's going to be very different because I've learned a thing or two as well. So like there is progress, there is growth, there is change and development and learning and wisdom and all this stuff. And that has its own pathologies if you lean into that in the wrong way. But I also think that there's something potentially pathological about this non-dual emptiness that somehow explains everything. And, if you even try to ask questions about it, it's sort of like, well, you're just being too academic or you're being too theoretical. You're not looking from the heart.
Questions about it.
No, I'm not saying this is from you. I'm just saying in the broader discussions, I think that occur around these issues, it's like, I don't see it that way. It's like, I think it's actually kind of a false dichotomy itself to presume that there's some deep difference between heart and head. I think that the life of philosophy, if you go back to the Pythagoreans and the Platonists and of course the Neoplatonists, like that was a lived reality. That was a mystical orientation towards life. And that's another thing that I feel like is an important spiritual practice. Anyway, I'm rambling too much. I know I'm on your show and I'm being interviewed in a sense by you, but I don't want to just hog the mic and I'm also
that would be pathological.
right. Be too egoic.
Right. Well, so have you read Almas?
No, I haven't, but I want to. And like the whole diamond approach stuff. Yeah. Yeah, that's on my list.
That's largely where I'm coming from.
Okay. Could you give a kind of orientation towards some of that?
So the central practice in the diamond approach is not meditation, it's inquiry. So it's the curious, open-ended exploration of experience, of consciousness, of reality, of anything and everything.
I like that.
And it's oriented from the love of truth, and wanting to know the truth and what's true and what's real. And that opens up the curiosity, and that opens up the exploration. And so that's the orientation. It's this kind of adventure of discovery. And then we do like the various meditations for different purposes to, prepare the vessel, so to speak, to become better vehicles for inquiry. And then it sees the individual consciousness as like a sense organ of the universe.
I like that.
And there's that saying, I guess it's a Sufi saying, like, man needs God as much as God needs man, or God needs man as much as man needs God.
I'm digging this. This is great. This is very much what I'm interested in.
Yeah. And so and there are actually like 4 distinct turnings of the teaching. And so the non-dual stuff that you're talking about is the second turning of the wheel of the diamond approach teaching, what we call the boundless dimensions. And you've got the absolute, which is the most fundamental. You got the logos dimension, which is creative dynamism. These are all non-dual, boundless, infinite. You have the dimension of pure awareness, and then you've got pure presence, and then you've got, and that's getting into the fullness. It's like each one is a greater degree of fullness. And then the 5th major boundless dimension that we work with is divine love, which is like the dimension of pure presence, but with the affect of love. And this is the traditional Christian mystical experience. God is everywhere and God is love.
I was going to say, now, is there one beyond that?
Well, the dimensions can co-arise and stuff like that, but these are the 5.
Well, you mentioned the love component, and that was another thing which actually surprising we didn't touch on, but that's huge for me as well, because, and again, I am aesthetically, Nietzsche talked about you got to smell things out in a way, for that yes saying and that healthiness, but I'm aesthetically driven. I not meaning that I just go with what sort of pleases me the best or something, but that you use your intuition based on what sort of speaks to your soul in terms of orienting yourself of like, what am I aiming for here? And anyway, along those, and I'll also root that in kind of a metamodern orientation as well, because when we were talking about earlier, right, is like once you've sort of I'm not going to do the nihilism thing anymore. I'm going to do this. You orient yourself in a direction. And so what's your lodestar there? Well, it can't be absolute truth or following this, teaching or that teaching, because that's what you threw out and blah, blah, blah. So you have to have a different kind of orienting factor. And I think that listening to, however you want to think about that, your heart or, your call to beauty or the eros or whatever. Anyway,
Yeah,
and Plato
all of
talks
that.
about that too. Anyway, so I just said that aside. But where
You're
my
sort of zeroing in on the value of the individual, your own individual, um your own individual desires, your individual unique idiosyncratic attraction.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, Joseph Campbell said, "Follow your bliss," and I don't think that that's just some new agey relativistic thing. I think that there's actually a lot of wisdom there. But
Yeah,
what I'm getting at, though, is that for me, I read these mystics who talk about experiencing divine love, right? And that speaks to my soul. I'm like, whatever this experience is of just you
because
come
you're a
up.
Christian.
Well, so I wonder, right? Now, the question there is it just because I sort of was enculturated in a Christian
Maybe your
context?
soul chose to incarnate in a Christian context. I mean, who
Maybe.
knows, right?
Yeah.
But so yeah. So there
But
are
well, just the last thing there is that, I mean, there's this diamond approach that it sounds like you're a practitioner of or engaged with, and there's this divine love thing, right? So like I feel like that waving, aside the, oh, you seek the transcendental love experience of, the ultimate Godhead. It's just, well, you were raised Christian. It's like, well, come on now. There's a little bit more than that, and also cross culturally. I think that you do find, though I'm be probably hard pressed to think about an Eastern mystic who had that particular experience. So that maybe goes against my point. But I think there's something to that. Anyway, you were going to say something.
yeah, I mean it could be your soul just naturally is gravitating to that experience, or it could be that that was sort of the ideal, or who knows what it is, right? It could be a number of things. But we, in the diamond approach, we recognize it as one of the possibilities, and we sort of, every soul is different. Um, so yeah, you may be drawn to that, but then emptiness is manifesting in your consciousness, and that's the way. That may be the way to the divine love, right? Like, who are you to say?
Yeah, or it could be the opposite too of, you experience a divine love and then you're like, oh, there can't be anything past this. And then it's like, oh no, there is. It's this emptiness thing. And that's pretty cool. And in fact, the jhanas are kind of like that, where you experience infinite consciousness. And then past that, it's like, oh, it's infinite void. Anyway.
Well, that's what
So,
we're talking about. We're talking about the different boundless dimensions.
yeah, right.
So that's the second turning. But the first turning is the knowledge of the soul,
Mm-hmm.
the individual consciousness.
I was just surprised that there's two whole turnings after boundless love, like it seems like that's a pretty good place to end, but I'd be curious where it goes from there.
Yeah, I'm not gonna, yeah, exactly. But I'm not gonna go there today.
Okay.
Well, you'll have to wait for part two.
That sounds good. It could be a great opportunity for me to read up on some Almas and some Diamond approach, and then
Yeah, that's a good idea.
yeah.
So basically the relationship between the first turning and the second turning is that, yeah, these are like this is like the fundamental non-dual nature of reality, these boundless dimensions. There is, in a way, it looks hierarchical because, like I said, the absolute is the most fundamental in a way, but that doesn't mean it's the best or the ultimate or the ideal. It's just one of the possibilities. And you can experience it directly, without going through the whole hierarchy, so it's hierarchical and it's non-hierarchical. And that sort of hints at the later turnings.
Very cool.
But the relationship of that timeless, eternal, infinite reality to the individual consciousness is that basically all of that individuates. It instantiates as a unique expression. And so that so the unique instantiation is what we recognize as the essential identity, or the point of light, or the point of existence. Almas actually has a book called The Point of Existence, which is about this. And I believe you find this in Meister Eckhart's work. Am I right about that? Maybe. Anyway, so that's the unique identity, the unique instantiation of the divine. And it's like that's the transition point between the boundless dimensions and the soul. The soul being the individual consciousness, the medium of consciousness, and then all of the capacities of the soul, the soul gets from those dimensions. So the soul has the potential for emptiness, it has the quality of empty spaciousness. The soul has creative dynamism. The soul has awareness, it has presence, it has love. So all this stuff is like happening in this vessel, this vehicle of consciousness. And then that gets patterned. That gets patterned by experience. And that forms the ego. The ego is like consciousness crystallizing in a certain stable form.
Hold that thought really briefly, if you can. Yeah, no, you're frozen. Okay, I'll be.
Here's the void. An opportunity for whoever's watching or listening to be with the emptiness themselves. What comes up? Are you bored? Anxious? Wanting some content? Or can you just be here? With nothing.
You were saying?
We were just being with the void while you were gone. So, what was I saying? I don't even know.
You were talking about the
oh yeah, the soul becoming conditioned and crystallizing in a kind of a stable form that we take to be ourselves, our identity, and that's the ego or the personality, the crystallized conditioned self. And a lot of spirituality sort of regards the ego as this like aberration, as this like cosmic mistake that we then have to correct through spiritual practice. And we don't see that as such. It's just a stage. The ego self, the separate sense of self, is just a stage through which consciousness individuates and becomes stable enough to have the opportunity, the possibility of the opportunity to do the work. And then to start to metabolize those structures so that the self can sort of be reborn as the personal essence, which we call the pearl, which you may know from the Bible, the pearl of great price.
I do.
And so that becomes, the pearl is sort of the vehicle for actualizing in the world as a human being, as the divine made flesh, and then being able to function in the world from being rather than from the conditioned ego self. So that's a short little map, and it's not supposed to be a map, but there is a kind of map. Yeah.
I mean, I'm curious how I'm assuming, and I'll have to look into a lot more of this, but I'm assuming that Almas was a mystic who had these experiences and was sort of, this wasn't just, it could work like this, right? I mean, it must have been like a download of some kind.
Yeah, there was a download or two or three or.
Yeah. So if that's the case, I wonder.
But it wasn't his intention originally, I think.
Yeah. No, I just wonder how, when one experiences high level peak experience states, how one begins to organize them in some kind of way, right? It's sort of like if for example you have the boundless consciousness and love experience, but then you also have emptiness, what is it that makes you say, oh, well, this one wasn't quite as good as that one or something? What is the scale, what is the normativity, what is the nature of all that? Or is
how do you say one's better than the other?
Well, usually through valence, right? You say like, oh, this steak is good, but the one I had last week was a lot better. Or, hey, I'm having a mystical experience, this is so much better than steak, like stuff like that. So I which again, I think is kind of rooted in aesthetics as well, in the sense of sensibility and sense and all that.
Well, I can say that certain souls gravitate towards certain experiences more than others. It's like that's kind of the beauty of our uniqueness. But there also could be a sort of conditioned reason why you prefer fullness over emptiness, or just love over awareness, or even just like certain kinds of presence versus others. So for example, the diamond approach differentiates many kinds of presence. There are different essential aspects. So like you mentioned compassion at one point. Okay. So compassion is one, love is one. In fact, there's many kinds of love. Strength, will, essential will. But then there's power, which is like the black. And there's space. Space is another essential aspect, which is getting more into that void quality.
Yeah. But I mean, I think you do raise a really good question, right? Which is that if we are culturally conditioned to find certain states, let's just say higher valence, I guess, in some ways, and then as a result, kind of map those accordingly, there is a kind of background logic to our mysticisms. and I mean, this would be a very kind of postmodern, lens to look through at these sorts of things, right? But then it raises this question that, well, okay, if that's true, then and the culture is in some ways contributing to kind of the metaphysical map, if you will, then how does that relate to how we might shift culture or change culture? How does that relate to the evolution of culture? I guess is kind of where my mind goes with that. And then I feel like you can start to then frame that in metamodern or integral terms even, right? Because like if a culture and both East and West went through traditional phases in which you could argue in a Nietzschean way that they were sort of nihilistic, right? Or Hegelian sort of like unhappy consciousness, kind of, the sick soul and William James, all that stuff, right? That there's just this like, nihilistic bent. So you have to wonder about the mysticisms that arise from those periods and from those conditions. And then you can ask, well, if culture is changing and evolving, what does mysticism look like going forward? And if individuals shape culture, then in some ways individual proclivities are determining or at least influencing the mysticisms of the future, if that makes sense. So again, there's this important element to the degree that sort of taste and aesthetics is actually kind of a culture design factor at the spiritual level. I don't know, those are just some ideas that came to me. It's kind of exciting. I mean, that's where my mind wants to go, but
that is good
maybe
shit,
just
man.
nonsensical self-justifications and rationalizations. Who knows?
No, that is good shit. And I think there's like a kind of there's like a national soul in a way.
Mm-hmm.
That sort of skews us towards certain preferences, but not deterministically. I mean, there's still like in the West, we have a preference for individuation.
Right. Well, and I wonder, since the 20th century, when East and West have increasingly come together, what does that future milieu really look like once those are really effectively integrated? Is there sort of can you make a map by being like, okay, here's, and I think I even toyed with this at one point, like, here's sort of for lack of a better, well, this is, no, how do I say this? Let's say the negation, the emptiness. Here's the emptiness map, right? Here's the fullness map, and of course you can kind of tilt that on its side or whatever, do whatever. I mean, do these things stack on top of each other, or how does that work? I don't know. These are important kind of avenues for exploration. Or I do think it's also very possible too that like you could say, oh, that whole fullness thing you were doing, yeah, we've got that too, but then there's this deeper layer and it's the emptiness thing that happens in. It's like, oh, okay, well, that's how that works then. Maybe, you'd have to experience it. But yeah, question is just going forward, how will culture continue to shape our proclivity towards ideals that affect our mystical teloi, plural of telos. Never get to use the plural of telos. In fact, I think almost conceptually the very idea doesn't quite make sense, but we're pluralists here, so we have teloi. I will say, speaking of aims and ends, that a sense of an end is upon me because I do have to depart shortly.
Yeah,
So,
we're at the 2-hour mark, and there's still plenty for us to talk about. So
indeed,
I anticipate a part 2.
Yeah, did you? I mean, I hope this was enjoyable and not just flim flam from me.
No, it was mostly garbage.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. This was really rich. I really especially
it was
just
really
because
rich.
Yeah,
it was rich. It was empty. It was beautiful and perfect.
Yeah, and it was lovely to meet you. And I'm full of the
this is
divine
our first time
love.
ever having even exchanged any words.
Yeah, this is true. And so I'm glad to have engaged in real time. And I agree. I think that there's probably a part 2 in the future. But yeah, thank you so much. I really
We'll have to
appreciate
get back to the future.
I'll have to. It's, the only way out is through.
All right, man.
All right. Much love. Godspeed. Take care.
Namaste. Peace be upon you and all the rest.
Indeed. Amen. Adios.
Ciao.